That stick, what exactly is that for?
It is a walking stick. I use it.
And you carry that everywhere you go? Because to me, something like that, that's a weapon. That could do serious damage to somebody if it was used the wrong way.
I have prosthetic legs. Without this stick, I cannot maintain my...
Officer Victor Vance was 11 months into his probationary period when he stopped a black man on the central path of Sutter Falls Community Park, told him his walking stick looked like a weapon, and when the man refused to hand it over voluntarily, took it by force and shoved him backward. The man fell onto the path and could not stand because Victor Vance was standing 4 feet away, holding the prosthetic support of a double amputee Army veteran, and did not yet understand what he was holding. What Victor Vance didn't know was that a park employee named Nora Sohn had seen this man every single day for 2.5 years, that she was already moving toward them when he pushed, and that the footage on 3 separate phones was already uploading before the man had even hit the ground. Before we go further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. Here at JPTV, if you believe that a man who gave his legs for this country deserves to walk through a public park without being pushed to the ground by someone who has been a police officer for less than a year, then hit that like button and subscribe, because we tell the stories that remind people exactly what respect looks like and exactly what happens when it is withheld from the people who have earned it most. Raymond Ford was 54 years old and had been walking the central path of Sutter Falls Community Park every weekday afternoon for the last 2.5 years. Not because his doctor had him to, though his doctor had told him to, but because the walk meant something to him that was difficult to put into words, and that he had stopped trying to explain to people who hadn't earned the right to the explanation. He had spent a long time relearning how to move through the world, and the walk was the daily proof that he had done it, that the relearning had held, and that the version of himself that existed now was capable of the same ordinary things that the version before had taken entirely for granted. He had enlisted in the United States Army at 19, the same summer he graduated from Harlow County High School on Fenwick Road, drawn by a combination of family tradition and personal conviction that he had carried since adolescence. His father had served, his uncle had served. The idea of service had been in the house he grew up in on Caldwell Street, the way furniture is in a house, present, load-bearing, unremarked upon, because it was simply part of the structure. He had completed his basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, been assigned to the 101st Airborne Division, and served 2 Afghanistan between 2007 and 2010. The first tour had been difficult in the ways that all tours are difficult. The second had been different. On the 14th of March 2009, during a patrol outside Kandahar province, the vehicle Raymond was traveling in struck an improvised explosive device. He did not remember the explosion itself. The first thing he remembered after that morning was a ceiling he did not recognize, and a pain that was present before his consciousness had fully returned, which is its own kind of education about the relationship between the body and the mind. He had lost both legs below the knee. He had spent 14 months in rehabilitation at the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland, learning to walk on prosthetic limbs with a patience and a discipline that his rehabilitation team would later describe in their notes as among the most sustained they had encountered in their combined experience. He had been discharged with full honors. He had been awarded the Purple Heart. He had gone home to Sutter Falls and spent the following years finding out who he was in the life that came after the one he had planned. He was retired now, living in a modest house on Renwick Lane, 3 blocks from the park, and his days had the structure of a man who understood the value of routine, because he had spent enough time without one to know what its absence felt like. He rose early. He ate the same breakfast most mornings. He read the news on his tablet at the kitchen table and allowed himself 1 cup of coffee before the walk. The walk itself was always the same route, in through the Crestfield Avenue gate, along the central path past the fountain, around the east loop to the maintenance building, and back, out through the same gate he had entered. 40 minutes on a good day, 50 on a harder one. He carried a dark wooden walking stick that had been custom fitted to his height and grip by a specialist at the Sutter Falls Veterans Affairs office on Langton Street, and he used it not as a crutch, but as a balance point, the third contact with the ground that the prosthetics sometimes needed on uneven surfaces or in moments when his concentration was elsewhere. He was 30 minutes into his walk on a Wednesday afternoon in late October when Victor Vance noticed him from the park's northern entrance. Vance was 26 years old and had joined the Sutter Falls Police Department 11 months earlier after completing his training at the County Law Enforcement Academy on Industrial Parkway. He was assigned to the community patrol rotation, which covered the park and the surrounding residential blocks during afternoon hours. He was not, by any objective measure, an experienced officer. He had 11 months. He had the academy. He had whatever instincts he had arrived with and whatever habits those 11 months had begun to form. And on this particular Wednesday afternoon, those instincts and those habits combined to produce a conclusion that he reached before he had covered half the distance between himself and the man on the central path. He saw a black man moving slowly. He saw a stick. He saw the deliberate, careful pace of someone navigating the path with more attention than most people gave it. And he decided somewhere in the space between observation and approach that what he was looking at warranted investigation. He reached Raymond at the midpoint of the central path, about 40 meters from the fountain, and fell into step beside him without greeting. "Excuse me," he said. "Can I ask what you're doing in the park today?" Raymond looked at him. He had been asked questions like this before, in parks and on streets and in other public spaces where his presence had prompted someone to decide it needed explaining, and he had developed over the years a response that was neither warm nor hostile, but simply direct. "Walking," he said. Vance nodded slowly. "You live nearby?" 3 blocks, Raymond said. He did not stop walking. Vance kept pace beside him. "Mind if I ask about the stick?" he said. Raymond looked at the stick in his right hand, then back at Vance. "It's a walking stick," he said. "It's pretty substantial," Vance said. "Looks like it could do some damage." Raymond stopped walking. He turned and looked at the officer beside him with the full, measured attention of a man who has heard something so removed from reason that he needs a moment to confirm he heard it correctly. "It's a walking aid," he said. "I use it to walk. That is what it is for." Vance told him that in his assessment, the stick constituted a potential weapon, and that he was going to need Raymond to hand it over while he conducted a brief check. Raymond told him he would not be handing it over because it was a walking aid, and he needed it to walk, and there was no legal basis for the request. Vance told him that his slow pace and his manner had appeared suspicious upon observation, and that the stick added to his concern. Raymond asked him specifically what about his manner had appeared suspicious. Vance said he had been moving in a way that drew attention. Raymond said he moved the way he moved because he had prosthetic legs, and that the stick was part of how he maintained his balance on uneven ground. Vance looked at him for a moment. Then he said that he was still going to need to see the stick. Raymond said no. He said it clearly and without heat, and then turned and resumed walking, because he had given the officer a full explanation and the officer had chosen not to hear it. And Raymond Ford had not walked 14 months of rehabilitation and 2.5 years of daily routes through this park to stand on a path and argue with someone who had been a police officer for less than a year about whether his walking aid was a weapon. Vance reached out and grabbed the stick, not gently, not in the way of someone attempting to examine an item. He grabbed it the way a person grabs something they have decided they are entitled to take, with both hands and a pull that was designed to remove it from Raymond's grip, regardless of what Raymond's grip intended to do about it. Raymond held on for a moment, instinctively, the way a person holds on to the thing that is keeping them upright. And then the stick was gone, and Vance had it, and Raymond had nothing, and the path was uneven where the tree roots had lifted the edges of the paving stones, and Raymond Ford went backward and hit the ground. He did not make a sound when he fell. He lay on the central path of Sutter Falls Community Park on a Wednesday afternoon in late October, with both prosthetic legs on the ground and his walking stick 4 feet away in the hand of an 11-month officer who was looking down at him with an expression that had not yet caught up with what it had just done. 30 meters away, near the door of the park maintenance building on the east side of the path, Nora Soane had already stopped what she was doing and was moving toward them. Nora Soane had worked at Sutter Falls Community Park for 6 years as a park maintenance attendant. And in that time, she had developed the particular kind of familiarity with the park's regular visitors that comes not from any formal introduction, but from simple repetition. The same faces, the same routes, the same times of day, month after month after month, until the park and the people in it become one continuous thing that you know the way you know your own neighborhood. Raymond Ford had been part of that picture for 2.5 years. She knew which gate he came through. She knew his route. She knew that he moved slowly and carefully, and that the walking stick was not decorative and had never been decorative. And she knew all of this the way she knew everything about the park, not because anyone had told her, but because she had been paying attention. She covered the 30 meters between the maintenance building and the central path at a pace that was as fast as she could manage without running, and she arrived to find Raymond on the ground and Victor Vance standing over him with the walking stick still in his hand. She looked at Raymond, then at the stick, then at Vance, and when she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it carried the specific weight of someone who is not going to be redirected or dismissed. "What happened?" she said. Vance told her he was conducting a lawful stop and that she needed to step back from the scene. Nora looked at him and did not step back. She looked at Raymond on the ground and said, "Are you hurt?" Raymond told her he didn't think anything was broken. She looked back at Vance and said, "That man comes to this park every single day. I have known him for 2.5 years. He is a veteran. Those are prosthetic legs. That stick is how he walks." Vance told her again to step back. She told him she worked in the park and that she was not going anywhere. By this point, 2 other people who had been on the central path had stopped and were watching, and a third was on her phone with what Nora assumes either the police or a camera application. And in either case, Vance had an audience that was not going away. Raymond spoke from the ground. His voice was even and unhurried, the voice of a man who had decided that the most useful thing he could do in this moment was be as clear as possible. He told Vance that he needed his walking stick back in order to stand up, and that without it, he could not get up from the ground under his own power. He said it simply and without any anger in it, which made it hit harder than anger would have. Vance looked at the stick in his hand. Something shifted in his expression, but it did not shift far enough or fast enough to be called understanding. He told Raymond that he would return the stick once he had completed his assessment of the situation. Raymond asked him what assessment remained to be completed. Vance did not answer that question. Nora crouched down beside Raymond on the path. She told him she was going to stay with him. Then she looked up at Vance and said in the same steady voice she had been using since she arrived, "He cannot get up without that stick. You need to give it back to him right now." Vance told her the stick was currently being held as a potential item of concern pending his evaluation. Nora looked at him for a long moment and then said, "It is a walking aid for a man with no legs. That is all it is. Give it back." The small group of people around them had grown to 6 by now, and none of them were moving away. 2 phones were up. Vance looked at the phones, then at Nora, then at Raymond on the ground, and for the first time since he had grabbed the stick, he looked like a man who was beginning to understand that the situation he was standing in the middle of was not the situation he had thought he was creating when he started it. He had not given the stick back yet. But he had stopped holding it like he intended to keep it, which was at least the beginning of something. Nora stood up from beside Raymond and looked at Vance with the particular stillness of a woman who has run out of patience but has no intention of losing her composure, because composure in this moment was more useful than anything else she had available to her. She had worked in this park for 6 years. She had seen things happen on these paths, arguments, accidents, moments of ordinary human difficulty. and she had learned that the way you carry yourself in those moments determines everything about how they resolve. She held out her hand toward Vance, palm up, fingers flat, and said one word: "Give." Vance looked at the outstretched hand. He looked at the stick. He looked at the crowd of people that had gathered around them on the central path. 6 people now, maybe 7, with 3 phones raised and nobody moving away. And the confidence that had carried him through the last several minutes began to show its first cracks. Not because he had decided he was wrong, but because the weight of everyone watching him be wrong had finally become something he could feel. He looked at Raymond on the ground. Raymond was sitting upright on the path with his prosthetic legs in front of him and his hands flat on the paving stones beside him, holding himself steady with the quiet, practiced composure of a man who had spent 14 months in rehabilitation, learning to exist in a body that the world had not yet fully adjusted to accommodate. He was not asking for the stick again. He had already asked. He was simply waiting, the way a man waits when he has said everything that needs to be said, and the only remaining variable is whether the person he said it to is going to do the right thing. Vance walked the 4 feet between himself and Raymond and held the stick out toward him. Raymond took it without a word. He positioned it on the ground beside him, placed his weight against it, and pushed himself first to a seated position, and then, with the slow and deliberate effort of someone who had done this 10,000 times in harder circumstances than a park path on a Wednesday afternoon, back to his feet. He stood at his full height and straightened his jacket and looked at Victor Vance with an expression that contained no heat, no performance, and no forgiveness. Just a clear, cold, unhurried assessment of a man who had been weighed in the last 30 minutes and had come up short in every category that mattered. Laura stepped forward. She was not a large woman, and she was not a loud one, but she had the quality of presence that some people carry when they know exactly where they stand and are not interested in being moved from it. She told Vance she wanted his name and his badge number. He gave them. She repeated them back to confirm she had them right. And then she said in the same measured voice she had been using since she arrived on the scene, "This man's name is Raymond Ford. He is a United States Army veteran. He served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and he lost both of his legs to an IED in Kandahar province in 2009. He has been walking the central path of this park every weekday afternoon for 2.5 years, and in that time he has never given anyone who works here or visits here a single reason to look at him twice. I know him. Every person who works in this park knows him. And what you just did to him has been recorded by at least 3 people standing on this path right now." Vance said nothing. There was nothing available to him that would have improved his position, and he seemed to have arrived, however reluctantly, at the understanding that speaking further was only going to make that worse. Raymond reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and removed 2 documents that he carried with him every day, not because he believed he should have to, not because the law required him to produce them to a rookie officer on a public path in a park he had been walking for 2.5 years, but because he was a man who had lived long enough in his body and in this country to understand that preparation was not the same thing as surrender, and that having the truth documented and accessible was sometimes the only thing standing between a bad situation and a worse one. The first document was his Veterans Affairs identification card, issued by the Sutter Falls VA office on Langton Street, with his photograph, his name, and his service status printed clearly on the front. The second was a copy of his military discharge papers, which listed his unit, his deployment dates, the nature of his injuries, and his decorations. The Purple Heart was listed third from the top. He held both documents out toward Vance without speaking. Vance took them. He read the VA card first, then unfolded the discharge papers and read through them slowly, his eyes moving down the page in the silence of a man who is reading something that is dismantling every assumption he arrived at this park with. He read all the way to the bottom. His face when he looked up did not show remorse, because remorse would have required him to have arrived at a genuine understanding of what he had done, and he had not gotten there yet. What his face showed instead was the particular blankness of a man who has had the floor taken out from under him and has not yet identified anything solid to stand on in its place. Raymond took the documents back. He folded the discharge papers carefully, returned both items to his breast pocket, and then looked at Vance one final time. His voice when he spoke was the same voice he had been using since the beginning of this encounter. Quiet, level, and entirely without the anger that the situation had more than earned. He said, "I gave my legs for this country. I walk this path every day because I spent 14 months learning how to walk again, and I am not going to stop doing it because someone with 11 months on the job decided my walking stick looked suspicious." He paused for just a moment, long enough for what he had said to settle. "You pushed me to the ground. I want you to think about that for the rest of your career, however long that turns out to be." He turned and continued his route, slowly, deliberately, with the same careful pace that Victor Vance had looked at from the northern entrance of the park 40 minutes earlier and decided needed investigating. Nora watched him go, and then turned back to Vance, who was standing on the central path of Sutter Falls Community Park with 6 people around him and 3 phones still recording and absolutely nothing left to say. The footage was online before Raymond reached the Crestfield Avenue gate on his way out of the park. The woman who had been recording from the path had posted it while Nora was still talking, and by the time Raymond got home to Renwick Lane, took off his jacket, and sat down at his kitchen table, the video had already been shared several hundred times. It was 1 minute and 43 seconds long, and it showed everything from the moment Vance grabbed the stick to the moment Raymond stood back up and straightened his jacket. It showed the fall, it showed the crowd, it showed Nora arriving and standing her ground, and it showed Raymond on his feet at the end, delivering the last thing he said to Vance in a voice so quiet and so composed that several people who watched it described the contrast between his composure and what had just been done to him as the most difficult part of the video to sit through. By the following morning, the video had been viewed over 2 million times. By the afternoon, it was on every major national news platform, and the detail that kept appearing in every version of the coverage was the same one. A decorated Army veteran who lost both legs in Afghanistan was pushed to the ground in a public park by a rookie officer who called his walking stick a weapon. That sentence, in various forms, was the thing that traveled because it required no additional context and no interpretation and left no room for the kind of competing narratives that usually accompany these stories. The facts were the story, and the facts were enough. The Sutter Falls Police Department released a statement by the end of that first day saying they were aware of the incident and that an internal review had been initiated. The statement expressed concern for the veteran involved and stated that the department held its officers to the highest standards of conduct. It did not mention Victor Vance by name. It did not address the specific conduct captured in the footage. It was the kind of statement that says everything is being taken seriously without committing to any particular definition of what taking something seriously actually means. And the public response to it made clear that nobody was satisfied with that definition. Vance was placed on administrative leave the following morning. The department's Internal Affairs Division began its formal review that same week, and the review did not take long because the footage was comprehensive and the witness statements, including Nora Sohn's formal account submitted in writing to the investigating officer, were consistent and detailed and left no material gap between what the video showed and what the people present had experienced. Nora's statement was 4 pages long and included a full account of her knowledge of Raymond Ford, his routine, his history as she understood it, and the specific sequence of events she had witnessed from the moment she left the maintenance building to the moment Raymond walked away. She submitted it without being asked twice. Raymond filed suit 3 weeks after the incident. His attorney filed against Victor Vance personally and against the Sutter Falls Police Department for negligent hiring, inadequate training, and failure to maintain appropriate supervision of a probationary officer. The filing was specific and well documented, supported by the video footage, Nora's statement, the accounts of the 3 other witnesses who came forward, and Raymond's complete military and medical records, which established beyond any possible dispute both the nature of his injuries and the necessity of the walking stick that Vance had called a weapon. The Purple Heart was referenced in the filing. So was the 14 months of rehabilitation. So was the specific finding in Raymond's VA records that his walking aid was a medically necessary mobility device, documented, certified, and issued through the Federal Veterans Affairs system. The suit attracted the attention of several veterans advocacy organizations within the first week of filing, 2 of which submitted formal statements of support, and 1 of which assigned a dedicated legal observer to the case. A congressman whose district included Sutter Falls wrote a letter to the department demanding a full accounting of the incident and of Vance's training record. The letter was entered into the public record. Vance was terminated at the conclusion of the Internal Affairs review, 4 months after the incident. The review's findings, released in a summary document that the department made available following a public records request, cited his failure to conduct an adequate assessment of the situation before using force, his failure to respond appropriately to information provided by both the subject and a credible witness, and his conduct in removing a medically necessary mobility device from a disabled veteran without legal basis. The summary did not use the word racism. It did not need to. The findings said what they said, and the public had already drawn its own conclusions long before the document was released. The city settled Raymond's lawsuit 11 months after it was filed. The terms were not publicly disclosed, but were confirmed by his attorney to include financial restitution and a commitment from the department to implement revised training protocols covering disability awareness and mobility aid recognition for all active and incoming officers. Raymond continued walking his route, every weekday afternoon in through the Crestfield Avenue gate, along the central path past the fountain, around the East Loop, and back out again. Nora still saw him most days. They did not always speak. Sometimes she just nodded from wherever she was working, and he nodded back and kept walking, which was the whole point and had always been the whole point. If this story moved you, then share it with someone who needs to hear it today. The men and women who gave everything for this country deserve to walk through a public park in peace. And the least we can do is make sure that when that peace is taken from them, the story does not stay quiet. Subscribe to JPTV. We are not done telling the truth.